four questions that I should address as part of my presentation. Very useful to have this. Number one, my experience on global governance issues in non-health areas, which have an important bearing on the health sector, like environment, climate change, trade, and so on. The second, as Rural Development and Environment Minister, how does the Government of India engage with foreign players, foreign investors, and how do local concerns and priorities get reflected as part of this engagement? Third, what is the role of civil society in development issues, a point that Saida Hamid has raised? And fourth, what I see is the emerging role of India in global negotiations. As India becomes economically more powerful, does it mean a change in the style and substance of India's negotiations on various developmental issues? So these are the four areas that Yashodhara laid out for me. And before I address them point-wise, I thought I should share with you some concerns of mine on the health sector, as I have seen it in the last couple of years, and on which I have had some opportunity to do something about it when I became a minister in the Rural Development Ministry. I think the most important fact that one has not yet fully appreciated or acknowledged in the Indian context is the relationship between health expenditures and rural indebtedness and rural poverty. In fact, the emerging picture on poverty in India is less to do with income poverty or consumption poverty and more to do with health poverty. And the single most important contributor to rural indebtedness in study after study has been found to be expenditure on health. In fact, economists have a static concept of poverty. They have a dollar a day poverty line, and people who are below the poverty line are below the poverty line, and people who are above the poverty line are above the poverty line. It's a very static head count ratio that economists are accustomed to. But we know increasingly poverty is a dynamic concept. It's a vulnerability mapping, that families come in and out of poverty. There are large numbers of people bunched around the so-called dollar a day line, and depending on weather, depending on expenditure, depending on economic and social circumstances, these families can fall below the poverty line in 1 year, and they may also get themselves above the poverty line on another year. So poverty as vulnerability is far more important than poverty as a static concept of a head count below the poverty line or above the poverty line. And as I mentioned to you, studies after studies in India have revealed the criticality of expenditure on health as a determinant of rural indebtedness. In fact, there's a book now that's come out by a very outstanding Indian economist, civil servant turned economist, Anirudh Krishna, who's at Duke University. And he, over 20 years of studies, he summarizes in this book. And his most powerful conclusion is that poverty in India is determined by health expenditures. I mean, that's the one-line conclusion of his study. And those of you who are not familiar with this, I think I would suggest very strongly to read this. And this is actually, this fact, as I said, has not permeated official thinking as yet. We still look upon poverty as, income poverty, calorie poverty, consumption poverty. But, somehow we don't think of health as a determinant of rural poverty. To give you another example of the link between poverty and health, in the last couple of years, the Ministry of Rural Development has been implementing a very ambitious rural roads program in order to connect remote areas of our country through all-weather roads. And one of the consequences of building these roads has been increased accessibility to health workers, and we have now built evidence to show that villages and habitations which have been connected are beginning to show better health outcomes which they were not showing when they were not part of this connected network. So the short point I want to make is that the notion of health as a very important determinant of rural development, as a factor in rural development, whether it is in terms of rural indebtedness, whether it is in terms of rural connectivity, is something I think in India we need to pay far greater attention to than we have in the past. The second element of health planning, which I tried to incorporate in our vision, was the crucial role of water and sanitation. And if there's one sector in India that's been neglected through the decades, it's been water and drinking water and sanitation. In fact, I mean, I'm not a health expert, I'm not a health professional, but I've read extensively on health, and all that I have read leads me to believe that all the great breakthroughs in health have come not necessarily from health-related interventions, but have come from investments in hygiene, water, and sanitation. I mean, it's these factors that have really led to improvements, including in our own country, in states like Kerala, and in our region, countries like Sri Lanka. So the importance of water and sanitation as a primary social determinant of health outcomes has in fact, in my view, been underplayed. And not only that, India is seeing, as you know, the paradox of India is the third largest economy in the world, growing at an average of 7 to 7.5% over the last decade, but having almost 50% of its children underweight, suffering from malnutrition. Now, how do you account for this paradox of malnutrition in a rapidly growing economy? And I have argued for the last 15 months or so, and perhaps because I argued it so vehemently, I'm no longer the minister in charge of that ministry, that the primary determinant of malnutrition is sanitation. That if, as long as you have poor sanitation and poor hygienic practices, you are not going to really have a situation where nutrition is going to be valued, or even if it is valued, it is something that is going to be absorbed. We are all aware of the tropical enteropathy and the work that has gone on in the African setting. But what has taken place in the African setting is true very much in India as well. So really, when we talk of health, we should really be talking of much greater investment in water and sanitation. Sanitation not just because it looks better when people are not defecating in the open, but more so because it has a profound linkage to the nutritional status of children, which then determines health outcomes. The third area which I have tried as part of what Saida said, my vision for health, is that India is perhaps unique in the world where we have almost 70% of our expenditure on health as private expenditure, and about 30% of it is public expenditure. So everybody recognizes in India the absolute necessity for increasing public investment in health. But I have tried to argue that public investment in health does not necessarily mean public delivery of health. And we're going to think differently, that if we're going to have the traditional public investment in health with public delivery in health, then we're going to have health centers without doctors, without health workers, because the incentive structure in a public setting can never approximate a private setting. So I'm not arguing for privatization of health services. I'm one of those, in fact, who's been consistently arguing for increasing public investment in health, but also been asking for some innovations in the management of that increased public investment in health. And one of the innovations that we are attempting in the Ministry of Rural Development is to make local women's self-help groups responsible for health outcomes, responsible for managing community health facilities. And we have started this in some states, and we're already beginning to see greater degree of accountability of health personnel to the local community-based organizations, in this case women's self-help groups, because women really have the greatest stake in health. So these are just some three issues that I picked up from my own experience for the last couple of years, which have a direct bearing on what you're doing. Number one, the relationship between health expenditures and poverty. Number two, the linkages of water, sanitation, nutrition, and how they relate to health outcomes. And third, of course, is the need that we need to have greater public investment in health, no doubt, but combined with certain innovations in the delivery of these health services, particularly in the organization of these health services. Let me mention one other point before I address Yashodhara's point. The other important insight that I've tried in my own way, you might have seen the latest issue of The Economist on Bangladesh, where I've been quoted, where what Bangladesh example shows is that you don't need high economic growth. You don't have to wait for high economic growth to deliver superior social outcomes. That you can have superior social outcomes at lower rates of economic growth. I mean, Kerala is a good example in the Indian context. When you compare Kerala, a relatively low growth state, with Gujarat, one of the fastest growing states of India, you find on all health outcomes, Gujarat is much lower than in Kerala. You compare Bangladesh with some of our high growth states like Andhra, Karnataka, Maharashtra, and in fact even Gujarat. You find in Bangladesh many of the health related indicators, infant mortality, total fertility, maternal mortality, are far superior. Whereas Bangladesh's economic growth record has been consistently lower than that of India. So while economic growth is essential to generate the resources for keeping up high levels of interventions in the health sector, you don't necessarily have to wait to generate that high economic growth. You can have superior health outcomes at lower rates of economic growth. And Bangladesh really is the classic example in our region where they have delivered better health outcomes than India as a whole, and many Indian states in particular, but even at lower rates of economic growth, which means the importance of local level institutions, which means the importance of local governance. You are talking of global governance, but what Bangladesh shows is the importance of local governance, and often ignoring the advice of global governance experts and focusing on the local governance issues. I think that's really been the key to delivering more superior social outcomes. Global governance in non-health issues and my experience and what does it mean for health. Let me take two areas here. One is on trade and the other one is on climate change. I was involved with both. In fact, I was very much involved in the amendment to TRIPS. The one amendment that everybody was asking for TRIPS was to ensure that in the case of medical emergencies, public health emergencies, particularly AIDS, malaria and tuberculosis, TRIPS, which is heavily weighted in favor of producers, should be counterbalanced by taking into account the interests of consumers as well. And many of you know that TRIPS was amended in Doha almost a decade ago, and today TRIPS provides for the balance to be struck between producers and consumers. And that is how, for example, anti-AIDS drugs manufactured by Cipla or Ranbaxy have found their way into the African market in a very, very large way without having attracted the invocation of TRIPS. So that's a very good example in which public health concerns was used in a non-health setting, really, to bring about a fundamental change in the trade-related intellectual property rights regime. And by and large, you will see countries like Brazil, Argentina, and India, in fact, now. We are a large number of cases now in India, if you read, where patents granted to foreign companies, and in fact even to Indian companies, is being challenged. In fact, we have an extraordinary situation of an Indian company, Avasthagen, which took out a patent on a traditional knowledge medicine. And this was based on the Ashoka tree, and this was challenged by civil society organizations, and they filed for a patent in the European Patent Office, and the patent was not granted. So it's there is certainly in today in the discourse, particularly on TRIPS, particularly on intellectual property protection, a much greater sensitivity to public health concerns. That is because TRIPS was amended. We still have a problem with the Convention on Biodiversity. There is no convergence between the Convention on Biodiversity and TRIPS. That remains a very big lacuna in global governance, and we hope that we would be able to bring about this convergence between the Convention on Biodiversity and TRIPS, because then that would really then protect sources of traditional knowledge as well, because today, as we know, countries like India or Brazil or Madagascar are victims of biopiracy on a very, very large scale. This is something that I think this has been a positive development, and I would certainly say that health concerns have been reflected very, very significantly on the trade area. Now, coming to the climate change negotiations that have taken place, I saw that the WHO has given a report recently on how health is a critical determinant of sustainability. Now, these are negotiations that have taken place, but we do not really have much knowledge, or we have not had much progress as far as climate change is concerned. When I was Minister for Environment and Forests, I had commissioned a group of medical experts to work out what are the health impacts of climate change. In fact, the National Institute of Communicable Diseases in Delhi came out with a study which talked about how malaria impacts are going to be influenced enormously by changing weather patterns and by the changing monsoon behavior. But unfortunately, we are still a very, very long way to go on getting any form of international agreement or international consensus on climate change. And I think there are lessons for global governance experts in health from the lack of progress on global governance on climate change. And let me suggest to you a couple of reasons why we have not made progress in arriving at this international consensus. The most important reason is that the approach in global governance in climate change has been top-down. It's not been bottom-up. It's a bunch of well-meaning evangelists who are deciding what's good for the rest of the world, and they are pushing targets down European countries, America, China, India, Brazil, Africa, AOSIS countries, and so on. And I have taken the position when I was minister that this top-down approach is politically not going to be saleable in any country. And what countries need ultimately are engagement scenarios which they can sell to their domestic audience. And therefore, one should really have a bottom-up approach. Now, what does a bottom-up approach mean? A bottom-up approach means that every country decides for itself a portfolio of actions that it will undertake, and it would then hold itself accountable internationally to that international community for those implementation of those actions. Now, it's true that when you have a bottom-up approach, a pledge and review approach, as it were, the level of ambition is not going to be very high. The level of ambition is going to be somewhat muted. But it is better to start small, it is better to start realistically at a lower level of ambition and build it up as countries get more experience and countries become much more confident of negotiating with each other. Unfortunately, the entire architecture of global negotiations on climate change is top-down. It's the Kyoto Protocol, it's the Copenhagen Accord, it's the Cancun Accord, and every year we go around reinventing the wheel. The net result of it is climate change is a reality, but any agreement on climate change is far from being a reality. And it will never be a reality because the fundamental assumptions of the architecture are flawed. The second flaw in the argument, the second flaw in the global governance structure, which has relevance for you, is that there is absolutely no economic anchor in the negotiations. What do I mean by an economic anchor? An economic anchor means that as countries become richer, they take on greater and greater responsibilities. You don't expect a country with a per capita income of $1,000 to have the same degree of responsibility as a country which has a per capita income of $30,000. But in the entire climate change scenario, you have Annex 1 countries and non-Annex 1 countries. You have the rich countries and you have the poor countries. And there is no idea of gradation. There is no place for countries that move up the ladder, the countries who become richer, who take on greater responsibilities. So, and this has really stymied progress with the lack of an economic focus in the architecture, that countries have an economic ladder on which they climb, and as they climb the economic ladder, they take on newer and greater responsibilities. That is singularly missing in the global governance structure of negotiations. And thirdly, of course, there is no organizational anchor. Now, where you have international negotiations on monetary policy, you have the International Monetary Fund. Where you have international negotiations on trade, you have the World Trade Organization. But in climate, you really have no international anchor where countries can submit their actions, portfolio of actions, and hold themselves accountable for. So, actually, if you're interested in global governance, how not to do global governance, climate change is a perfect example. Because we've been clutching around for the last 10 years and we have visited all the exotic places that there exists on the planet. We've gone, it's been held in Bermuda, it's been held in Cancun, it's been held in Copenhagen. But every year this battery of negotiators just keep reinventing the wheel, keep adding square brackets and footnotes. The net result of it is that we are a long way ahead, away from having any meaningful agreement. But the reality of climate change is here. The health impacts of climate change, the agricultural impacts of climate change, the impact of climate change on the behavior of the monsoon. These are incontrovertible. But we have a long way to go. And I think global governance has to be incremental. Global governance has to be at a pace that countries are comfortable dealing with domestically. Because countries that take on international obligations have to sell those international obligations to a domestic constituency. And if you're not able to sell to a domestic constituency, you're not going to be able to sell it abroad. So, and here democracies particularly are vulnerable. The United States is vulnerable. India is very vulnerable because we have large domestic constituencies, multiple stakeholders, different interest groups. Not everybody agrees on what the right approach is. And therefore, before you enter into any international agreements, you have to create the conditions domestically to make that engagement a reality. And therefore, the incremental approach, a bottom-up approach, a pledge and review approach is far more conducive to an international agreement than having a set of grandiose plans and grandiose indicators which are thrust on every country irrespective of the level of development.